Cool.
So obviously they're class.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Okay, well, I'm going to start here talking about my book about traveling in Palestine, which was actually the 1990s. And as everybody knows, it's even worse than ever, or it would certainly appear to be that way. And I usually start by actually the library, the JFK library helped me enormously for a year in getting this book into my manuscript. Actually, it was an ebook only into book form. And they just provided this incredible service. It was like having my own free staff.
Wow. Wow.
Yes. So here we go. I traveled in Israel, the West Bank, and spent one amazing day in Gaza in the 1990s, as I just said. And I was writing of my experiences each time. It was about 8 times altogether. When I would come back to Mallorca. And once part of my account was published 8 columns at Christmas time in a book, an English newspaper, The Reader, widely circulated in Spain. Okay, so my manuscript of my travels and what's now referred to as historic Palestine. Israel tries to get people to stop using the word Palestine, so you have to put the word historic in front of it. Uh, and I had left all these important things, including this manuscript, in Turkey. And when I came back, I had been traveling. The company had been sold and it was gone. My manuscript was gone. So then I came to live in Mexico for some time, for a period of time after that. And in February 2015, I began to reconstruct my memories to try and experiences of traveling in the Middle East. I often say the Middle East, and people think you're referring to anything but Israel. And I didn't think it would be possible. So the result of this reconstruction of the book and the publishing of it, presentation of it in book form that I have here today, which we'll all look at some point, it's just nothing short of a miracle. That I was suddenly I wrote a few pages that I'll never be able to put this all back. But thankfully, I have a good memory, and it all started flooding back. And I just started writing, and the book just began to write itself. So, this is something. I was originally sailing with my former partner on a ship called the Luker Wycliffe. These are commercial ships, and it stopped in Haifa, which is at the top of Israel. And incredibly, I still had in my mind that Golgotha, which actually means the skull, was this horrible, ugly hill outside of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, where the Romans performed their executions. Well, I just thought it would still be there. It's just, I did. So, and I think that I didn't stop to consider that after 2,000 years that would not be possible. And I think that kind of naivete is indicative of just how powerful stories from the Bible are when you learn them as a child, in Sunday school, for example, as I did. Uh, how they will imprint so powerfully in your memory, in your psyche, so to speak. And in Haifa, I got out and I was able, there's all kinds of like Sufi, Baha'i pilgrimage, the different sects in the Middle East. Everyone claims Jerusalem is their spiritual center. And I visited Tel Aviv. In my descriptions of these visits, my impressions and comments and conversations of the many Palestinians and Israelis I spoke to are recorded here. Some of them I hope to be reading today. And I wrote this book because I began to realize how critical it is for United States citizens, a majority of their tax money going to the state of Israel, to know about the history of Palestine and to know what's going on there today. I mean, often I would speak to people and tell them about the refugee crisis and the war in 1948, and they go, "Oh gosh, I didn't know that. No wonder there's problems there," things like that. And yeah, and my visits showed me that to this day there is a woefully unbalanced and very inadequate coverage of the complex issues bedeviling that region to this very day. I hope to, by writing this book, I hope to shed some light on why the conflict is still unresolved. And at this point, according to many different analysts, hopelessly unraveled. So we have to go back to one of the points of the modern state of Israel and what happened in Palestine. Goes back to 1913. It's called the Balfour Papers. It was a piece of legislation passed in the British Parliament that was put forward and passed by Lord Balfour. Balfour, a British parliamentarian at that time. And it declared that a homeland should be created in Palestine for the Jews. Further, it stated that the rights of the Jews to the Holy Land were so ancient that it superseded the rights of the indigenous population of Arab peoples. Also, they're not all Muslim, many are Christian, and a very much bigger part of the indigenous Arab population is Christian than is ever discussed or imagined. Not to mention, many Jews have been living in Palestine for centuries. Some people say, well, it was according to the British mandate, 25% of the population. I talked to a Muslim guy and he said, oh no, Jews were everywhere, maybe 40%, maybe half. And I talked to an Arab Jew and he said, 25%, you gotta be kidding. We were everywhere in the Holy Land, everywhere. So it's really tough to get a serious consensus on a lot of these population issues. And anyway, right, and the Arabs got, thousands of years perhaps. Some say, well, we think we still had some of our bloodline family heritage went back 2,000 years. And I talked to one family who were Palestinian. They were Catholics, but it's a group of Catholics I never heard about before. But they were people of means, let's say. I think this man owned half of Haifa. Certainly, the father he owned a great portion of the commercial region, and they knew the most erudite priests, real scholars. And he said that his ancestors came there 750 years ago. Well, that's quite a spell, as I would say too. All right, so then it should be pointed out, aside from Lord Balfour and what many would say was a racist document passed by the British Parliament, it should be pointed out that the only other Jewish British parliamentarian at that time was a man named Gerald Kaufman. He came right out and he denounced this document as racist. He declared that a partition of Palestine would cause such conflict that it would inevitably lead to bloodshed and war. And he just said, well, that's enough not to seriously consider this, in his opinion. And his analysis which for many would have said was obvious, very sadly turned out to be exactly the case. He was right. So then in 1920, the League of Nations was formed, and part of their stated objective, of course, the League of Nations was sort of preceding the current United Nations, and part of their goal was the reason for the British mandate to make a preparation was to create, I have to go back, in 1920, the League of Nations made, as part of their foundation when they were formed, the stated objective to create a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And in great part, this goal was the reason for the British mandate. To make such a preparation, the British they went in, they built roads. This is when the Ottoman Empire had crumbled. It no longer existed, which had been a vast group of territories. Okay, so the British mandate came in, and they began to prepare Palestine. Okay, they put in civil service, they built roads. That's not to say that Palestine had no infrastructure prior to these events. It's like they were preparing for a British and then American kind of colony in the Middle East, dominated by these Western forces. They put in their own Western and British infrastructure. And okay, that's not to say that Palestine had no infrastructure prior to these events. Palestine enjoyed a very strong merchant class for centuries and under the Ottomans, and cultural developments centering around the fact that it was the home to the three major Abrahamic faiths, Judaism being the first, followed by Christianity, and ultimately Islam. You can read stories about Russian women of means, wealthy, who would go on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And in those days, like on the train, it was possible. I think this would be like in the late 1800s. And they would, during the course of their time in Jerusalem and their religious obligations, they would fall in love with these wealthy Muslim Palestinian merchants and end up staying there and having children because they didn't have birth control in those days. And it's just there's such a web of events in Palestine historically. It's just like looking underneath a building and seeing all the layers and foundations that once existed. Okay, many Jews are recorded, 100,000 entered Palestine during the British Mandate, as the British Mandate sought to create this homeland for world Jewry, often to the consternation of the Arab population. Many more attempted to enter Palestine, but were prohibited by the British from doing so, as the mandate attempted to keep a careful balance and status quo between the two populations. The White Paper was released by the British Parliament in 1939, which set a limit to 70,000 Jews in the next 5 years allowed to enter Palestine. So we're talking about Jews going in. It's Jews from the West or the East or Eastern Europe or Russia. There were, and it's often overlooked in histories, many Jews already living there who were Arab Jews who spoke Arabic. All right. And this was an attempt, this limiting 75,000 next 5 years in 1939 was an attempt to appease the Arab population, which had become alarmed at the amount of Western Jews entering Palestine. Arab population doubled under the mandate, but Jewish population increased tenfold. The continuing entrance of Jews was to be allowed only on, according to the British mandate, an approval by the Arab authorities at the end of the designated 5 years. You can see how things changed. That was let's see, well, I think that was yeah, it was in 1939. Okay, so then in 1948, Israel signed its Declaration of Independence in May. Inside the United Nations, the ratification for a Jewish state never made it to the Security Council due to the fact that the entire Arab world voted against the partition of Palestine. The support of an Israeli state in that vote inside the UN only reached 48%, close, but still below the 50% necessary to present a request to the Security Council of the UN. In spite of the lack of approval for a Jewish state to be created in Palestine, a group of Jews prominent in the design of the Israeli state, most notably Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion, signed a declaration of independence and declared itself a sovereign state. I mean, you could say much like the United States just rang the Liberty Bell and says, okay, we're a free and sovereign state now from Britain. Anyway, but very different circumstances. So there's a very quick trip through a complex history in the beginning of the current story of Israel and the Palestinian crisis. So there were prominent Jews who did not, from the very beginning, support this Jewish state in Palestine. Mark Merrick Idelson was a brigadier of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, where the only time the Jews in the Second World War took a stand and fought, and as the, see, I can't remember what it was, I think 1942 or 43, and it was the end of the war, and the Nazis and police went in and they fought bravely and valiantly, the Jews of Warsaw, but in the end they were taken over by the SS, and many people lost their lives. But Merrick Idelson did survive, and some others, but he opposed, much to the great dismay of many other Jews. He opposed the state. He said, this is not exactly based on a real just creating a just situation. Okay, and then you have the other situation, which shows to me how deeply in denial Ben Gurion and his government were about the demography. You know how they said it's a land without a people for a people without a land, but it was densely populated. I mean, this is, all right, I'll finish with this part. What happened was they declared themselves a state. This was later on in 1948. They said in that year, that same year, I believe, they said, okay, any Arab person, non-Jew of Palestine, you want Israeli citizenship, come and we'll give it to you. So all these people come en masse, and after 100,000, they were shocked. They just didn't want to admit the true demography. And they were forced to. Then they said, oh, well, we'll never have a predominantly Jewish, Western Jewish state if we let all these, people who are Christian and Muslim Arabs get Israeli citizenship. So then all the people that were apart from that original 100,000 were stateless. They had no way to recover their possessions or their belongings. The Golda Meir went to the States, and there was a dairy going out of business. So she got all these parts, brought them back to Israel, all the mechanics, and they made arms out of them. And the first IDF, Israeli so-called defense forces, now they're called the Israeli occupying forces currently, they went in, and the people that wouldn't leave or didn't even know what was going on were thrown out of their homes. at gunpoint, and they were taken across to what's now the West Bank, the border between what's known as Israel proper and the West Bank. And they just said in Arabic, Arab, flee, flee, just get away. And they had no redress, these people. I mean, nothing. They just were thrown out.
As is.
They were stripped naked. I mean, you might as well have stripped the people naked. That was, and the whole world, the whole West accepted this. Although one doubts that they, for a long time, Arabs acknowledged, they said, surely the people in the United States and Canada, for example, were not aware of what was going on. Not really. Okay. Albert Einstein initially supported the Israeli state, but only up to a certain point. He would not support it if it involved going to war with the Arabs. He said, no, that's my limitation. Later, after Israel claimed that Einstein had fully supported it, he hadn't. They lied because when that 1948 war started, he withheld his support. But, Israel just read right ahead and said he did support it anyway, and it's no laughing matter. And at that time, in 1948, many refugees flooded into Gaza. And Gaza at the time it has a long history. It was very prosperous. They have fantastic soil. They could cultivate anything in Gaza. And they had a fishing industry that went from Cyprus to Egypt. And they were well known in the area because of the fishing and the agriculture industry that were really highly developed. And it was a very peaceful place. Also, this was before the revolution in Iran, when Muslim women began to dress like nuns with all these cloths wrapped all over them. And the Muslim women used to have pretty regular clothes, not completely sleeveless, but not all that covered from top to bottom. And they wore like a little doily on their heads, which Muslim women in Malaysia still do. And they were absolutely bewildered. No one knew what was going on, who all these refugees were, and why they were there. And, okay. Now, going back to the political situation, and at this point in the early 1950s, a few years later, there was a French Jew, actually of Lebanese origin, and his family had immigrated to Paris, to France. And he was a journalist. His name was Maxim Khalil. And he entered Palestine, continuing his journalistic work, and he was a member of the left in the Knesset. The Knesset is the political governing body of Israel. When he learned of a prominent Jew, before I get into this story, I remember how he wrote during that 6-day war. He knew everyone, all the Israelis supported the 6-day war, but he knew there was something wrong. They had not been attacked. And if you'll read Michal Palad, I can give people a list of these books if you want afterwards. I know I'm giving a lot of information. Michal Palad's father was Matu Palad. He was one of the generals that put together the 6-day war. And they acknowledged among themselves there was no existential threat. They just did it in an effort to control the region. And he stood up at the end of that 6-day war. Matu Palad, the general, he went to everybody. We all sit down. He said, now look, we've got all the Palestinians in this one area. Let them have their state with these defined borders. They wouldn't do it. No way. And Nico Pellet, his son, who's absolutely dedicated dissident, Israeli dissident, who's lived in the United States for a long time. He said it was actually 5 days. They had to stick to this 6 day creation story. And it was just all built on myth and the obsession with domination. Okay, so then getting back to Maxim Khalil trying to explain some of this stuff, and he couldn't believe he was the only one that was questioning this 6 day war attack. He learned about a prominent Dutch Jew who entered into, took a big interest in Israel, the fledgling state. So he went to Palestine and he um, was surprised. He went to some of these prominent political figures at the time and said, "We know I'm talking to a lot of Arab leaders, and they're all completely open to making peace and conflict resolutions in the territory." And they said to the effect, I don't have this specific statement, "We don't really want dialogue with them. We just want to control. We want to be the ones in control. We don't want to have equal or partner sharing or anything remotely like it." And so what happened was this Dutchman, I don't remember his name, of course, he gives it in his book. The name of the book is called How Israel Lost Its Soul. I mean, it's just ago. And I mean, someone who was of notoriety in Israeli politics, someone who had a reputation, a professional reputation, someone who readers and politicians should have been paying attention to. Nothing. Didn't affect anybody, or it certainly did not affect change in policy. So this Dutchman, he went out and he began to speak on his own. He said, "Just forget you people," to like the government of Ben Gurion. And he went out and he began to speak with Arab leaders on his own. Well, before you knew it, this man was dead. And it was obvious to Khalil that the Israeli government was behind his death. So when Khalil went and publicized the incident in the Israeli media, suddenly he found the Israeli authorities arrested him and they trumped up fake charges. So eventually he was released. I don't remember exactly how long, but he left Israel. He knew he could not possibly be an honest person, a journalist in the politics, without continuing to expose these what people wanted to call excesses, injustices, rights violations. So he left. He could no longer go on living there. So yeah, it just shows that Dutchman, it just cost him his life trying to make peace. And then once again, going right along with all these pieces of information I have is Jacob Timmerman was a Jewish Argentinian human rights activist who actively opposed the dictatorship in Argentina at that time. I can't remember. I guess it was the late 1950s. I'm not sure. So he immigrated to Israel. Well, his opinion was that Menachem Begin was totally unbalanced. And Menachem Begin was part of the Lehi, the outlawed army. The Haganah was the legal army of the fledgling state of Israel, responsible for sowing terror in the West Bank, trying to get people to leave, like they would in the documentary "O Jerusalem." The writers of that book, who are both journalists, I mean, they got this from the files of the Red Cross. This old man is sitting down to his lunch under a tree outside his home, and they just come along, all of that group of people, the Stern Gang, the Lehi, just shot him dead, just shot him in the heart, and he just fell over. And then there was another long incident in a place called Said where it was many more people. And of course, I'm not saying there weren't Arab terrorists, but a lot of people say, of course, they don't support violence ever, but there never was that kind of violence before. There was not Arab terrorism at that time because the people were all. It was like in Sarajevo after the Tito died and Yugoslavian uh, country broke up into these different parts. Suddenly, everybody went into battle with each other. But before there had been peace, people celebrated each other's holidays, and it was very much these people of different religious communities in Palestine were closely linked culturally. It might have been the same thing, celebrating each other's holidays, but almost the same psychological and social connection. So Jacob Timmerman said, I have fought authoritarianism my whole life and in Argentina, and I will not accept it in Israel. And he left. So now I come to the point where this is, I read Time magazine. Of course, Time magazine is published all over the world. When you go to read Time in Europe, it's a little bit different than Time in the United States. You're going to see some stories printed in Time in Europe that would be completely disallowed, would be edited right out of the Time published in the U.S. So this is one I read about a young Palestinian man who had painted a Palestinian flag on a wall near a military tower, which are everywhere in Israel. The Israelis ran out before he could get away, grabbed his hand and electrocuted it. They placed it under the wire of all these electric wires on the tower. Of course, it was just burnt to a crisp. So you could imagine the horrifying pain, agonizing pain. So aside from that, the agonizing pain, he lost his hand. So then he began to petition the Israeli government for a prosthetic hand. In his case, I remember the first thing when I read this article, I noticed this lady, and she looked like she was from the counterculture of the 60s here in California, like, leftist, real alternative. That's what she looked like. So this case of this man requesting the hand, a prosthetic hand that he could use, it came before her, and she rejected it. They kept making him go back over and over, saying, "We'll come back and request again." And there was no threat, there was no bomb, there was no nothing, just the flag and paint. And this is what causes many people to say and to think. There has not now, nor has there ever been a Jewish state. That is, when you consider all the humanism and the science and the arts contributions Jews have made to Western culture over the past centuries, that died with the state of Israel. What you see now on the map that calls itself Israel is in fact a continuation of the Third Reich and its brutal atrocities and injustices. Hitler was fascinated by the occult. He had meetings. He would call his top SS men to a castle, a secret castle in Bavaria or somewhere in the Alps, and they would perform rites. The floor was just covered. I think there's even a picture of it I saw once. Certainly a very graphic description. The floors was covered with all these esoteric symbols, and he was obviously they were calling up the worst spirits. And I mean, I have often thought of that double-headed eagle that was one of the Nazi symbols. It's like I could just see it flying out of Germany when the Third Reich collapsed and roosting in Israel. They could not get rid of that evil that they summoned up. It was as though that was the case. It, well, then, there was the massacre at Deir Yassin, where I don't like talking about it. The most horrifying atrocities were committed. And so it's now, for years, Israel denied it. They said it wasn't true. Finally, they had to admit it happened, and that it was done by the members of the Stern Gang and the Lehi, the Outright Army. And it's so, and there are a lot of other atrocities. I mean, there was like QOM, where um, the famous man now dead, the one, Ariel Sharon, he went in and killed everyone in their village with his army because an Arab terrorist killed a 50-year-old woman and 2 children driving a bus, like a school bus. So then, in retaliation, he went in and murdered all the people. And it just constantly went back and forth. The terrorists would go crazy. They would say, Allah Akbar, God is great, and do some crazy thing without thinking. And then Israel would just come back and hit them 100 times harder. I saw an interview once. Netanyahu was like 28. And his answer to the crisis, he said, well, we'll just, he didn't actually say we'll all live together. He said, well, they can, that's what it says to do in the Bible, to multiply and replenish the earth. He said, so if they're just living like that here, and he had advocated basically a one-state solution. He actually did. And you see how everything changes. People get in power. I mean, it appears this is like so concentrated, the problems of government. But all over the world, people want democracy, go out and demonstrate, nothing happens. And government has become like the beast in the apocalypse. It talks about the Antichrist, the beast, the false prophet. It's the government. I mean, really, we struggle to believe there's democracy anywhere anymore, really. Anyway, you'll talk to people like one man, he was running a restaurant in East Jerusalem, and he wanted to go study to be a doctor. Israel would not let him out because, like many men, Palestinian men, it's believed that they're going to tell everybody what's been happening outside Palestine, and they're going to create a cell or create groups of cells to oppose the state. So they just can't leave to study. And I don't know if you're Palestinian, if you could study at the big university in Tel Aviv. It's not clear. And so he had to give up his live stream. So people's movements are totally restricted. And then, I don't know, if you haven't traveled, you don't know, there's a newspaper in English. It's a financial newspaper, the Herald Tribune. It's been around a long time. It comes out of Paris every day. And if you travel, you'll know it because it's the only newspaper in English before everybody carried a computer and got the news on the computer. And I had just gotten back, I think it was my 8th and last visit there. And I saw this, it was August, the weekend edition 2001. And it was a story of 3 men who were beaten. I think, There were three men trying to get to their job, and they all worked at the same supermarket as delivery men. And they had to pass through, of course, the border between the West Bank and West Jerusalem. And for some reason, the guards, who were obviously in a psychotic state or who had just really gone crazy, they beat them up. They were slightly built, these men. They picked them up and bodily threw them against the wall of the checkpoint. They took their pictures, said, if we ever see you again, we'll kill you. When the men were bleeding profusely, they forced them to drink their own blood. This is in the Herald Tribune, which is a financial newspaper. So, well, they were in the hospital. I don't know, put in the hospital in West Jerusalem, or finally, or how it worked out. They got out somehow. I can't remember that last detail. But the owner of the supermarket where they worked as deliverymen was a rabbi. And when he found out, he was furious. And he went to the media with this story. And it's incredible. A lot of people, they just didn't react. He went to B'Tselem. B'Tselem is the first and oldest human rights organization in Israel. What B'Tselem means, made in the image of God. In other words, we're all equal, right? And because we're all human, we're all made in the same image. And B'Tselem, you know what they said? They said, we get reports like this every month. The only reason this is publicized is because the owner got so mad. She said, we would have stories like this every month, incredibly. And when many Israelis heard this story, in spite of the gruesome and inhuman details, they just seemed incapable of reacting. So now, Israel was created by the group of Western Jews to make themselves safe from ever being subjected to another Holocaust. But in attempting to make itself safe, Israel has made itself more, the people living, the Jews living in Israel have become more unsafe, as well as all the other people of the region affected by this strange shift in politics than ever. It's the most unsafe situation for Jews to live anywhere in the world. The biggest population of Jews is in the United States, and then in Germany, and then France. Even if there were two contiguous states with boundaries, like a Palestinian state of contiguous territory, not all separated by Israeli roads and infrastructure, to divide Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, this is still completely racist. No one seems to think of that as it's still basing each state on ethnicity, which is the problem to begin with. If you have a state that's ultimately solely based on ethnicity, what are you going to have? The result will be a racist economic, social, and political reality. So, and I said, I said this to an Israeli woman I met traveling in Mexico. She just said, "Oh, well, we have more problems than other people." Well, I mean, it's true in the Middle Ages, but those things aren't true for Jews anymore. They're not subjected to pogroms, or very likely ever will be, except if they continue to perpetuate the state that's supposed to make them safe. If the former South Africa had proposed to solve their political issue of apartheid, which is no different from what you have in Palestine, the world into one black and one white state, do you think it would never have been accepted by the international community? And the idea of an Arab and a Jewish state is exactly the same. It's so different. Many Americans are completely oblivious to what happened in the early 1970s with the USS Liberty, an American ship off the coast of Haifa. And they, the people aboard the ship that survived, well, I'll explain soon, said that there was a lot of surveillance. They thought there was intel, CIA agents on board. They thought they were there to surveil Egypt, what was going on in North Africa. But the fact is, they knew Israel wanted to invade Lebanon, and the U.S. didn't want them to. So and of course, there are flags flying all over the ship, a U.S. vessel. So Israel bombed it, and very heavily. And they tried to get it. They were so close to Israel, tried to get information to Israel were being bombed, and they just bombed them more. Horrified. And finally, and when, well, finally, there were books written about it. It is now very well known. But at the time, this got back to the White House, and who knows what kind of situation they had between the intelligence agencies and the actual White House and the cabinet, because people wanted it on the ship. They thought it should be known this had happened. And Lyndon Johnson said, "I do not want to embarrass our allies." I mean, it's unthinkable. What is going on? That they just said, "Oh, Israel didn't know. They thought it was an enemy ship." Well, of course they knew it was a U.S. ship. All their intelligence would have made that available. It was practically hugging the coast of Haifa, and it was marked with all kinds of flags and U.S. liberty. And they actually said that even Robert McNamara, the Secretary of State, I think at the time, he was interviewed about it, and he just kept saying, "Well, we didn't have this information, and it must have been some kind of accident, and we can't explain it." And finally, in the end, he could just barely talk about it or make any rational, no concise statement. It just became vaguer and vaguer and vaguer, more vague. And well, finally, a Republican, now deceased, Paul Finley was his name. He wrote a book, They Dare to Speak Out, and he exposed the whole incident. And the U.S. military, U.S. Navy covered it all up. Finally, the outraged families and spouses and children demanded that those who have been murdered by Israel on this ship receive proper burials, military burials, which they finally did. But no one can explain this incident, and who knows? So who knows how many others they have? And it's amazing to think. See, there's like a lot of myths and speculation about the 10 lost tribes. And many people say there's certain people, and the British Israelites, first they said, "Oh, it's the British that became," because they had all that power of empire at one time. They exhibited all this force. And then people began to think it was sort of Anglo. They identified it with, but the Anglo-Saxons were in ancient Europe and made from Germany and France originally. And people will say, no, it's to put up this idea, these different speculators, that it's the United States. And then there's two things that are unusual. This man, what was his name? Charles Russell, I think. He's one of these people that formed the Watchtower Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he's the one that made this big statement that the Americans, the country, the United States, was destined to have a powerful connection with Israel even before the modern. He was saying that even before the modern state of Israel. And the other thing, the United States is the only country where when male babies are born, they're very often circumcised in this country. Very often. Not uh, black and Mexican American, but so called white, whatever that means, non color, sort of, whatever people. They're often automatically circumcised as just as Jews are. And there's no country in the world that does that I know of. I mean, if you talk to people in Germany, they are, they say they don't do it automatically like that, that only Jewish male children have it done. But that's usually in a ceremony 8 days after the birth of the baby boy. Um, that is mysterious to me. I don't quite know why that practice, or who started that practice. I read about it once, but I can't remember the details. Another very strange incident was that in 1908, the New York Times published an article in which it said 6 million Jews in Russia were, were in imminent danger. People thought it would be fun to go into the little Jewish communities, especially in the countryside, and attack people in their homes or their schools or even their synagogues and desecrate them. 1 year later, in 1909, another article came out in the New York Times, almost identical, in which it said in Poland, 6 million, exact same figure, 6 million Jews were in absolute danger, risk of the pogroms, which Poland had many pogroms against the Jews. It was at one time, it would appear to the student of history, it was one of the most virulently anti Semitic countries. So, how did this, oh, and now, how did this figure keep reappearing? And before, it could be, you could go to jail if you said, I don't think it was 6 million Jews. If it was a different figure. If you go to the museum in Auschwitz, they had a history. They kept putting it down. It was three. They had a sign here. Uh, First, it was 6 million Jews lost their life in front of the museum in Auschwitz, the former concentration camp grounds of it. And then it was going down and down and down. And the last sign was 1.1 million Jews. Not that that in any way diminishes the horror and the nightmare of the Holocaust, I don't think. But what is this obsession with this figure? When they had the judgment of Nuremberg, they came out, that court, they said the figure of the Jewish lives alone lost is 6 million, and it's the record. It cannot be changed. This is absolute historic truth. Well, there is a man who's Jewish, a scholar. His name, he's in his 80s. I think he's still alive. Lenny Brenner, and he's written a book extremely controversial called 51 Documents, in which he says it couldn't possibly have been, because to have gotten that figure, they weren't all gas, they weren't all in ovens. There were 23 camps. Some were small. Most were in Poland. Only 2 were in Germany. But they said they would have had to have gassed and put in ovens 200,000 a day to get that figure. So unless, I mean, they would have broken the ovens or whatever. But if you count the people that were put in death pits, they made big holes, cavernous holes, and threw corpses in there, and then they had a hole left, and they had a grate that they would stick in it, and you could see through the hole. the decaying bodies. I mean, unless Europe was just covered with those death pits, and of course they didn't all die in they were not all gas. They did not all die in ovens. People died of malnutrition and uh, a disease. But it's still come very, very far from any now today with these investigations. Evidence that it could have been that figure. But what the 6 million figure keeps coming up and with uncanny recurrence. It's a strange matter. The one thing I didn't tell, to say the least, a strange coincidence. One thing is that these people, the Stern Gang and Lehi, um, now they found a letter that they wrote to Hitler saying, "We want to work with you. You can establish authoritarian states in one big authoritarian state in Europe, and we will in the Middle East." They didn't want Palestine; they wanted the whole Middle East. And people say that can't possibly be true. But it was discovered after the Second World War in the German embassy in Istanbul, and it was published by Noam Chomsky. I mean, Noam Chomsky, he wrote I'm sure you know, most people know who he is. He's one of the most famous, he's a man in his 90s now. He's written over 100 books. He's one of the most famous Jewish American dissidents, and has written many books on Israel. And that information was taken from one of his seminal works, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. And then everything had to be updated, so it was republished twice, about 10, 15, 20 years later. Now, I think I've presented quite a bit of information here. Some of you may be familiar with it, and some of you may not be surprised, but often people are amazed at the extent of the nightmare suffered by Palestinians in connection with this whole apocalyptic event of the modern state of Israel forming. I forgot this. I'm gonna have to stop because I can't. I'll remember in a minute. What I want to say is, what kind of questions, if any, does anybody have that we could bring up, that we can talk about more, that you don't understand, or that
What was your last point about Chomsky?
he published that letter
The letter that said,
that showed these people of Lehi and the Stern Gang got together and wrote that letter to Hitler wanting to work with him to establish authoritarian states in Europe and in the Middle East. I mean, the Israelis, they even have a coin which shows the whole Middle East. It shows all of Palestine, Jordan, part of Iraq, part of Lebanon, and then part of Syria, and the Golan, and the Negev, the Sinai. That's all they have on their coin. That's all what they want is this Israeli state. I mean, they never, and they were still trying. They were still trying. They still want, they called it Ersatz Israel, the greater Israel. And I saw a map once on the internet of Palestine under the Byzantines, in the Byzantine era. And it was divided into 3 parts. And it was called Palestina or Palestrina Primera, Segunda y Tercera in Spanish. And it was just huge. It was like, big part of the whole Middle East, similar to what the Israelis have on their coin. And it reached into, of course, what's now Jordan, which didn't exist then. And the Hashemite kingdom existed, but not the modern boundaries of Jordan. And it all the way down into the Sinai in Egypt, and then all the way up toward Lebanon and Syria and part of Iraq. I think it was really, really close to what they have on the coin. So I tried to find it again, and of course I couldn't. You know, on the internet you can see things and then suddenly they're just vanished. You can't pull it up, no matter how many times you try with the wording. But that was certainly fascinating, that Palestine was such a huge area in the first centuries. What was it? The first, second, third, and fourth centuries of the Byzantine Empire. And then, of course, it was taken over by the caliphates, by the rise of Islam, taken over by the caliphates of Baghdad and Damascus, and coming on up to the Ottoman Empire. And then before that, it was the Roman. Before all that, the Roman occupation. Any questions?
You know, I wanted to just say that I really appreciate your coverage of this story because you know I have a great personal,
Right.
intimate connection. My great grandparents emigrated from Palestine in you know the late teens as you know as Arab Jews, and they you know so they fled that area, they left that area, but they are part of you know that Arab Jew pre-existing population
Exactly.
that preceded Zionism,
Right.
Preceded the Ashkenazi influx. And you mentioned Ben Gurion and the Stern gangs, and one thing though that I'm not sure you made totally clear is that part of their campaign to force Jews to relocate, Arab Jews to relocate to their new state of Israel that they were trying to build was to provoke Arab communities to come in. This is how they built their power. Ben Gurion and the Stern Gang, and they coined the term terrorism. And they were the ones who initiated this tactic of disturbing the peace, inflaming the passions of local Arab people, so that the Jews in those areas became unsafe and were forced to flee into the arms of Zionism. And you know, so there are a lot of people who, you know, hearing this history are shocked that, you know, that there was so much manipulation by certain groups of other groups. The Sephardic Jewish populations of the Arab world lived fairly peacefully under the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. And that's just a part of the history that is completely obscured by modern propaganda.
Right, exactly. And I know what you say is true. The Jews who would have otherwise been peaceful became under threat by the Arabs who started to act aggressively against them because of the threats initially posed by Gurion, the Lehigh, and the Stern. Yeah, really vicious circles. And yeah, I mean, you can hear stories. Someone said, you know, the night before they signed the Declaration of Independence, just did it. People were, it was like wild, like a state of kind of insurrection in the big cities. And this was in May 1948. And people were going around, some people in cars with megaphones, Jews speaking to the Arabs, don't make war. We can work this out. I believe there were people like that, but they didn't get in power. Not hardly. Their sensibilities, their sense of justice was just squashed, but they existed.
And another thing that I don't think got mentioned enough is how the most religious Jews, the most deeply religious Jews, tend to be opposed to Zionism. that there are communities of rabbis with
The
the
Netra Carta,
Mhm.
Netra Carta, yes. I
And-
was
and-
supposed, I have that to mention still, yeah.
you know, the opposition is not merely from secular Jews on a political basis like Noam Chomsky or myself, as far as that goes, but the opposition to the state of Israel spans the religious spectrum. And there are many Jews who've been raised with this propaganda and react with you know with great anger at what's being done in our name. And I don't think that we get a voice. So I really appreciate you going over the history of this conflict because I feel like there's a lot of distortion, and a lot of people would believe that Jews are unified around this.
Oh, no, it's such a lie. Think of all the prominent Jewish dissidents that oppose Israel, the journalists, filmmakers, activists who have even gone into the West